It's a long story how I ended up that way, but I ended up without a vehicle and without water, and entirely by myself in Death Valley in California. It wasn't an accident. I did a pretty good job of making some enemies along the way, and I made the right mistakes with the wrong people, and I was basically left out to hang in the worst way. They say the Death Valley area has record-soaring temperatures of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That day, it felt much worse. Probably because I knew that I basically had been sentenced to death by the people that felt I owed them one. And it wasn't long before I began hallucinating, and the things that I saw made all those kid cartoons of characters lost in the desert much less funny, because I saw everything that those characters saw. Tropical oasis brimming with water. I had always thought that people mistook the heat waves for the shimmering of water. The mirages got 100 times more vivid. I tried to keep my senses and resist the urge to go towards any of these oases, and believe me, the urge to do so was very powerful. I had never seen a hallucination seem so concrete and so inviting. A few times, I thought I could even hear the splashing of water, and I did give in a couple of times. But as you'd expect, when I went towards the mirages, they'd either move further away or disappeared entirely. Soon, I couldn't even tell where I was or which direction I was going, and I thought that my death would be imminent. At one point, all the mirages had ceased, or so I thought. I looked around and saw not water, but a figure approaching me. In the dancing, dizzying heat, it was hard to tell that it was a person, because it looked to be unusually tall. I stand at least 5'10", and this thing seemed like it would tower over me if it stood right in front of me. It had an extremely muscular build. I say it because it had many features that were not even remotely human. It had a face that reminded me of the sleek snout of Anubis of the Egyptian god of death. Basically, I thought I was seeing a dog walking on its hind legs, too comfortably. A dog that appeared that it had spent the last 30 years in the gym, working on its muscles and tone. I began to think to myself that at least I wouldn't have to die of exposure. Having my throat ripped out by some unknown monster wouldn't be pleasant, but at least it would be quick. Instead of converging on me, it chose to walk next right to me. I was thinking it was going to be like a buzzard. It was going to wait until I fell over dead before it would tear into me. Then another one just like it came out of the heat waves, and it began walking next to me on my left. I began having visions of myself losing consciousness and then collapsing, and then both of them chewing on my innards before I could even hit the sand. My survival instincts rebelled against the thought, and I felt the slightest uptake of energy, so I forced myself to keep walking. A third dog creature, even taller than the other two, appeared right in front of me from out of the heat waves, and it was at that point that I thought that I was truly delirious, because the creatures appeared to be carrying a wooden staff. What was it going to do? It grunted at me and turned around and began walking. After it walked a few steps, it looked over its shoulder. I was apparently supposed to follow it. I thought that I was as good as dead, so I may as well follow whatever this hallucination would take me. If I began to lag behind, the other two creatures on either side of me would draw close. I was led over a very tall dune, which felt like climbing Mount Everest in the condition that I was in. When I got over the dune, everything made sense. And there in the wilderness with me was a U.S. military helicopter with a crew of soldiers performing a drill. They were airlifting a crate that they had been sent out to find, and they were being timed on how quickly they could find it with just coordinates. With the shock of hope I noticed that my 3 tour guides were now gone, and that's when I collapsed. I look back on the incident, and I question if it even really ever happened. Well, it did. I was wandering the desert, and I did find that helicopter. But about the 3 dog-like creatures, I've been listening to some of your stories as I put mine together, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone publish anything saying that dogmen were ever friendly. Most of your stories seem to portray them as feral, and sometimes they leave humans alone. Sometimes they don't. Maybe I really just did see the whole thing in a fit of heat exhaustion and pure and utter hallucination. This story comes from my brother, who's normally too busy spending his money on another hit of heroin instead of putting money towards something more intelligent like a phone. We touched bases just long enough for him to tell me about some crazy dramatic adventure that he has gotten himself into for his quest for another fix. Some are more exciting than others, assuming there's any truth. Some of them might even be suitable. He is not by himself a very creative individual, so I have a hard time thinking he could have made a story like this one up. So, here it goes. My brother is one of those customers that's bad for business. Even when he has money, his dealers have to chase him down. But more often than not, he doesn't have the money that he owes. And so he's kind of left. Some dealers just decide they're not going to sell to him anymore. Others decide that they will get the money that he owes them one way or another. And apparently, my brother made the mistake of accumulating a pretty steep tab with not just any ordinary dealer, but an entire syndicate that was responsible for the higher-end street drugs. The stuff that doesn't have any fillers. They didn't like it that my brother suddenly didn't have the money for the good stuff, so they went out of their way to drag him to one of their central hubs, located in a condemned underground cemetery. I know it sounds extremely far-fetched, but Google it. There are a few of these in the world. They're basically mausoleums, laid out underground like subway tunnels. Some of them have become structurally unstable, so they're no longer open to public, and that allows people like dealers and suppliers to move in. So, they locked my brother in a solid marble crypt that was big enough to have a couple of hallways. At first, you thought they did it to play on his anxiety. They had the place lit up with a few dim candles. Well, it got worse. Turns out, there was actually something locked in there with him. He could hear it stalking around the hallways, snarling. He was expecting to see a large dog or a hellhound, or a pit bull or something. But when it came around the corner, it was on 2 legs. The face was human, but also that of a wolf, and looked to be completely wrong. The teeth were more ogreish, very sharp, poking out its mouth, and all the rest of it was very canine, with the eyes and the ears, even the hocks of its feet, and the long, bushy, mangy tail. The worst part of the whole thing were the eyes. The first thing he noticed is that they were glowing, and had a very similar light to those that were the candles that were scattered. The second thing he noticed was that it looked like that of a hungry predator. The only reason why my brother survived the encounter, according to him, is that he slid in one of the cracks that would accommodate his scrawny frame, but was too tight for the bulk of this wolf creature. He wondered why the crack was so narrow, since such things are usually built to generously take care of an entire coffin. And then he realized that he was in a fracture in both the structure and the earth, due to the instability of the underground mausoleum. It was at that point that my brother had a mental breakdown and nearly beat himself bloody against the narrow confines of the fissure that he was in. His captors took that as a clue to withdraw the predator and let my brother out. They gave him 48 hours to run up the money that he owed. Needless to say, he found a way to pay it pretty quick. It does sound kind of far-fetched, but he made it pretty clear that these cartel had complete and total control over this creature or being, which to me is the main focal point of this story. To think that these people have control over supernatural beings, that's terrifying. I was trying to help my grandpa locate something that he had dropped when we went on a little fishing excursion to a pond in the middle of the woods that he owns. Well, come to find out that just because he owns the woods, it doesn't mean that he knows his way around. But I can't blame him. He's getting older, and his memory is slipping. He had managed to drop his eyeglasses and make it all the way back to the house without realizing that he wasn't wearing them. That's the entire man's personality in a nutshell. We retraced his steps. All the while I was thinking that his glasses were at the bottom of the pond. Of course, we checked, and there was nothing. In a moment of desperation, we split up and began combing the general area where they could have fallen. I found them, and I heard a crunching of trees and branches off to my side. I thought it was my grandfather, and I would finally be able to tell him, "Hey, we found him. Let's go home." I looked over to him to find out that he wasn't there, but instead confronted with a towering bipedal beast that eyed me with two glowing amber eyes. The brow and the eyes were nearly human, at least in bone structure and shape. The nose and muzzle definitely weren't. This thing was disgusting, covered in black and gray fur. I panicked inside when I saw that this thing was clutching my grandfather's hat. My first natural reaction was this thing had attacked my grandfather, and I was next. But instead, it bolted and ran away. 10 seconds later, I caught my breath and saw my grandfather looking around, telling him I was very relieved to see him. But he just looked at me puzzled and confused, having no idea what I was talking about. Since I still had his glasses, he might not have even noticed the strange wolf creature. I gave him back his glasses, and then he told me that he thinks he also lost his hat out there somewhere. I never told him about what I saw.